Greetings, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland. I am carrying on my series for GCSE history about international relations from the end of the First World War to the outbreak of the Second World War. In this video, I will summarize what was happening in the early 1920s and then look a bit at the League of Nations. So, 1919 to 1920, the Paris Peace Treaties were signed. Note that is plural. There were 5 such treaties. 1924, Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy, he seized Fiume, which is a peninsula that belonged to a country called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia no longer exists. It's now Serbia and a few of neighbours of Serbia. That's the former Yugoslavia. Some countries disliked the Paris Peace Treaties because they'd been on the receiving end of them. They'd been defeated in the First World War. They were former Central Powers countries. Other people in the Allied countries felt that these treaties were too lenient on their erstwhile enemies, though some people in certain Allied countries, particularly the United Kingdom, were beginning to feel that the Paris Treaties were excessively harsh. Many Italians felt that they hadn't gained enough from the First World War, that the tiny amount of land they'd been given didn't reflect their pains in the First World War. And Italy's seizure of Fiume was an example of that. The Italians felt hard done by, therefore they grabbed some Yugoslav land. There was not much logic in that, since Yugoslavia had not existed during the First World War. The Turks by this stage had pushed the Greeks out of their country, so the Greek army had invaded Asia Minor, that's the mainland bit of Turkey. The Greek army had been defeated and pushed out. Until that time, there'd been a large Greek ethnic minority in Turkey. Remember, what's now Turkey had been Greek in some part until the 15th century. And there was a large Turkish ethnic minority in Greece, because until the 1820s, the whole of Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, had been for well over 300 years. But then there was population exchange. Ethnic Greeks from Turkey moved to Greece, ethnic Turks in Greece moved back to Turkey. That was population exchange in the early 1920s, but that was best for both of them, partly because ethnic minority people were often massacred when there was a war between Greece and Turkey. The Turks had managed to get the Treaty of Sèvres annulled, and a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, was signed between them and their former enemies, as in France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and so on. And that was much more to Turkey's taste. Didn't give them everything they want, but went a long way in that direction. There were no gains for that for the Allies. They preserved a few of the gains of Sèvres, but not most. Germany had got away with not paying a reparations for a bit. In 1923, the Belgo-French occupation of the Ruhr, which had ended. The Dawes Plan was a new way forward for Germany, with new loans to the United States and rescheduling Germany's reparations payments to Western Europe over a longer timescale. So by the mid-1920s, the situation was improving and tranquility had been restored. Let's look at the League of Nations. So Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, 1930 to 21, had been the man who popularized the idea of founding the League of Nations. In fact, he wasn't the one who came up with this. It was a British academic who invented this word in 1914, and he was an anti-war person, as it happens. So this was Wilson's idea, whereby the intercourse between countries would be governed by certain laws, and governments would openly discuss their disputes. No more behind closed doors diplomacy, and therefore international disagreements could be solved by negotiation and without resort to war. However, many Americans became isolationists after the war. Most Americans were rapidly disillusioned and began to feel that the Allies were little better than the Central Powers. And moreover, the United States had gained nothing from the war. Wilson, in some senses, had succeeded insofar as his objective seems to have been to gain the maximum possible influence for the United States in the post-war world at the minimum possible cost, and it had stimulated the American economy. Americans did not want to be dragged into foreign conflicts again. They remembered the dictum of an early 19th century president that America should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Or George Washington had advised future generations of Americans to avoid entangling alliances which would drag America into conflicts that she could otherwise stand aloof from. But Wilson was very eager to get the United States to join the League of Nations. He travelled around the country, speaking very eloquently at public meetings about how it was crucial that the United States should join the nascent League of Nations. He said this would lower the chances of a recrudescence of war, but he did quietly acknowledge that the Treaty of the League of Nations might obviate the United States to fight in certain eventualities. He said that in the previous war, America's sons had not laid down their lives in a narrow national interest, but for humanity, for permanent peace. They were fighting for all mankind, not just for the United States. And he remarked that he'd received numberless letters from bereaved mothers saying that their sons had died for the world, not just for the United States, and indeed praising him for his noble efforts. But some people thought that he was foolishly idealistic, this was not going to work, and the United States should fight her own corner, not be involved in other people's fights. There was an elderly patrician Republican Senator, Henry Cabot Lodge. The Cabot Lodges were Boston Brahmins. There's that well-known ditty about how the Cabot Lodges only talk to whoever it is, another patrician family, and they only talk to God. And Cabot Lodge said he was not opposed to the League of Nations in principle, but he felt the terms of the League of Nations were too extensive, and they would intrude on American independence excessively. If the League of Nations had more limited powers, he might have agreed. So he read his speech in soft and measured accents, almost a monotone, scarcely looking up from his script in the Senate, and it was listened to in stock silence, and then followed the most thunderous applause. His discourse ended with "An American I was born," as in he was American through and through, and he could not conceive of being part of an international organization which might oblige the United States to fight when it was avoidable. He would not compromise on his nationality. So he got a rapturous reception, and it was partly on the strength of that a US Congress chose not to join the League of Nations. Wilson was very ill. In fact, he died only 2 years later, and he had to call off his speaking tour after a while. So that was that. The League of Nations was founded with Geneva as its headquarters. The city is in Switzerland, and Switzerland was a founder member of the League of Nations, not of the UN. So Switzerland had to revise its policy of neutrality slightly in joining the League of Nations. Why was the headquarters Geneva? Well, Switzerland's got its magnificent hotels. I'm sure the politicians and diplomats like that. It borders some very important countries like France, Germany, and Italy. France and Italy were permanent members of the Council of the League of Nations. What else? It's a multilingual country, speaking French, German, Italian, and Romansh. Not that anybody else speaks Romansh, it being a mélange of German and Latin. So Switzerland had been neutral in the First World War. The overarching objective of the League of Nations was to maintain peace. The League of Nations would put pressure on wrongdoing nations. The League of Nations had an assembly. Every country, no matter what its population, if it was a member of the League of Nations, had one vote in the assembly. The assembly could censure various countries. Imagine a social situation. If dozens of people are telling you are wrong, you are doing wrong, stop now. That psychological pressure is enough. Peer pressure, his moral coventry might be enough to force people to change their ways. Failing that, the United Nations could authorize sanctions against a wrongdoer nation. All other members of the League of Nations would refuse to trade. They will not buy from you. They will not sell to you. Countries need to do commerce. People can't get all they need from their own homeland. There's no complete autarky. We need to buy and sell. This aggression could be stopped without going to war, just through cutting off trade. But if war ever had to be fought, it would only be after 1 year of sanctions, only as an absolute last resort. The League of Nations also aimed to improve social conditions. But we'll come on to that later. So by 1924, the League of Nations record was already mixed. It had not solved the raw crisis. Remember, France was a member of the Council of the League of Nations. There were 4 Council of the League of Nations members: France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Italy. to begin with, it's just those four. The equivalent of permanent members of the UN Security Council today. The League had not been able to sort out the Corfu incident, and we know that Italy had got away with it. So the League of Nations was decidedly lacking in clout or muscle, to put it more crudely, because the League of Nations had no military, and the absence of the United States seriously hindered the League of Nations. The League of Nations could do nothing to impose its decisions on aggressors, because we're not going to trade with you. Yeah, but the United States will. And everybody knew that the United States was the workshop of the world, had a much greater economic might than any other country there was, greater than dozens of other countries combined. The very existence of the League of Nations, though, gave hope to some that perhaps solutions could be arrived at through an equitable means, and it would not just be might as right anymore. So the League of Nations threatened to apply sanctions to recalcitrant nations, but obviously this seldom transpired. Anyway, the League of Nations was successful in some small incidents. They got League countries to agree laws about shipping, because there's the law of the sea. White lead paint was banned because that's poisonous. That saved hundreds of lives annually. A Refugee Commission was set up to help refugees. Millions of people had been displaced after the First World War, and there were stateless people. Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian polar explorer, he was put in charge of the Refugee Commission, and he invented the Nansen passport for stateless people. We still have United Nations passports today. The League of Nations was the precursor of the United Nations, incidentally. So people could travel on that. And there's a square in Oslo named in honor of Nansen. Well, passport didn't help him, as he later disappeared in the polar expedition. That's enough for the moment.